Morning everyone. We're going to be doing a watercolour project this morning, and I'm going to be doing two of them. They're going to be quite different watercolour projects. Both are inspired by man-made landscapes really. The first one's going to be of St Paul's and the second one's going to be a Brighton Pier. Now the St Paul's one, which I'm going to show you in a minute, is a little bit more of a tighter version of painting, where the pier is going to be more about bleeds and having a little bit more fun with different mark makings that you can get the watercolours to do. Don't worry, I'm still going to keep this first one a little bit free and loose, so it doesn't have to be too tight. Now first of all, I've completed my drawing. So you can see here I've got just a HB pencil drawing that I've gone around, cleaned up with a putty rubber. I always like to set up a little bit of a border around the edge so that I can lean my hand on without worrying about that I'm going to lean onto my painting. So it's a good way to work. Now for materials, I'm working on 300 GSM watercolour paper here. I've got my reference image over here, which is by LED. Beautiful image, okay. I'll put the link in below. It's all royalty free so that you can use them at home and have a go at this. Then over to my right, I've got a set of watercolour brushes. These aren't anything, expensive. These are just some Daler Rowney Simple set, so you don't have to spend a huge amount of money. I've got a palette and a studio set of colours. Now the colours that I'm going to be using for this, don't worry if you don't have them, just have a go. That's the whole trick with watercolours, is to get a feel how wet you want the watercolours to be and how they react to one another. Colour mixing will come with practice, so don't worry about it. I'll talk you through what I'm doing as I go, but don't worry about it if you don't have the exact colours. I also have a toothbrush and a plastic kind of card. It's one of those loyalty cards from a shop that I'm going to be using for an effect to keep it interesting. I've got a yogurt pot for some watercolour mixing, in case I need to have two colours. So I've got my clean water pot there, and then I'll have my watercolour shades mixed up in there if I need to have quite a decent quantity. I also have a piece of kitchen roll so that I can dab off any errors or mistakes. So without much ado, let's get on with things, shall we? Now first of all, I'm going to lay down and I'm going to work light to dark. I'm going to deal with this in 3 different core sections. So I've got my core section down here, which is in the foreground of the sap green kind of tree area. Then I've got my more complex diagonal core going across here, which is a building, and we're going to obviously doing a little bit more complex, tighter colour mixing and application. And then I've got my sky over here. Now what I haven't bothered to draw in the trees, just see how it kind of takes me, but I think it'll look nicer without that tree there. I'm going to go for kind of a little bit of artistic licensing, shall we say, and bring in a little bit more sky. If I wanted to, because the sky's quite light, I can always put the tree on top and counteract that decision. So it's a better way to play things. So let's get on first with this section down here. So I'm going to deal with this section down here and put down a very unusual layer, shall we say. Then while that's drying, I can work up here in the sky. That will give me enough time for this to dry, and then I can start working up into the building area. See, I have got some kind of plan here. Actually, I've got quite a complex plan written down around the edge of this picture. By no means is this just off the top of my head. I have thought this through and planned out the colours before doing it. And generally with all watercolours you want to be doing that if you want something quite tight and polished as a result. So let me pour a little bit of water into my cherry pot. I'm going to first of all take a brush and mix up on my palette a little bit of very pale washed out sap green. So now I've taken my green, sap green mixed. I'm going to get some of it on my toothbrush, like so, holding the toothbrush at a quite steep angle to my piece of paper, and then creating these kind of, it's a lot like spray paint splats, which are quite nice. I'm going to sit underneath my foreground tree section. Now there's a little bit of a darker tree down here, so if I take some of my ultramarine and add that into that sap green, you'll see immediately the shade go a lot darker. Get a decent quantity on there. You can see that's much darker. I'm going to pick up a little bit of that and throw in that dark green. Okay, it's all already looking really good. and we've hardly done anything. So, clean my toothbrush. Put that to one side. Obviously you never use them for washing your teeth with again. And let's work up here on the sky section while that's settling down and drying. So for the sky section, what I got is a yellow ochre that I'm going to have coming up here. That yellow ochre is going to go into a violet shade. So there's a few different violets you can get out, or you know, in your art shop. I think I'm going for an ultramarine violet, if you want to copy me. Then from that ultramarine violet, that's going up into a pale blue. Okay, and that's going into the sky section. Now, as the pale blue is still slightly wet, and that's the trick here, it's the timing, slightly wet, I'm going to mix up a burnt sienna and ultramarine blue, which will create a grey cloud tone. And then I'm going to put that in so that I get some bleeds onto that section. Now, I'm a little bit aware that some of that green splattering has gone up here, so before I do any of that, I'm going to dab off that area and make sure that it's dry. I don't mind a bit of green splattering in the background because a lot of the paint is going to cover all of that, but it's wise just to make sure that it's dry and that it isn't going to start bleeding. You're going to get all these little green dots erupting through the background of your sky. Okay, now to do that sky, we're going to need to mix up a few colours. So let's get a brush. I've got some clean water. I'm going to take my yellow ochre. Now I'm going to wash my brush, so I've got my dirty water to the right. Then I'm going to take a little bit more clean water and just fade that out. Now I can always use this extra border to check the tone that I've got, and that's quite a nice tone down there. So I'm going to keep with that, that's great. Then as I work up, remember I was going to go into the violet. I'm trying to remember which one's my violet. I think it was that one. Got quite a few different prices. Now you can see that's fairly strong. So if I clean my brush, just take a little bit of water and dilute that down. Get a little bit more of that. Quite an area to cover. And remember then I said I'm going to use a cobalt blue. So if I grab a little bit of my cobalt blue. And again, I want all this sky is quite a washed out, it's sunset time. I need to make sure that it's diluted and fairly pale. Right, now let's go for it. Now when you're using this kind of process, generally what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a bigger brush, and then I was just using that smaller pointed brush to apply it in. I'm going to use the bigger brush just slightly dampen down that area. Now be careful not to dampen it too much. If you dampen it a lot, it will really dilute the colours, and before you know it, you won't have much pigment once it dries. It'll all dry so much lighter that you'll think, oh my goodness, I'm going to have to do it again because there's pretty much no colour on my piece of paper. And remember, you do want to go around the building. Anywhere that you've got water on, the water will flow the pigment shade. I'm just waiting. It can take something like a minute or two. It will dry fairly quickly if you're in a warm environment. It will obviously dry slower if you're in a cold environment. It's already starting to dry up here quite quickly. Where down here it's still a bit wet. Now because I can see it drying up here, I'm just going to grab a little bit more water to try and keep it fairly even on the water content on the paper, so that the shade all bleeds to the same level. Right, now let's grab a little bit of the yellow ochre. It's a little bit wetter than I'd want it, but it'll be okay. And I'm going to just dot in that yellow ochre, coming up to the lilac-y shade. So if you look on your reference picture, can you see the light coming behind the back of St Paul's? Now while I've got that yellow ochre, can you see the yellow up here as it's coming through the clouds? I'm going to dot that in. So I'm using one colour and I'm applying it wherever I can see it at that time. Trying to make sure that my paper is still staying wet or it won't bleed into one another. So you have to work at a fairly decent pace. I'm going to grab some of my lilac, and because my paper is at about a 30-degree angle, that all the colour is going to run downwards. So you do need your board at a slight angle. Remember, it's easy to add colour in and take it out, so worst case scenario, always go lighter and more pale with your shade than you actually think you're going to need. Into that. Now if you've got anywhere that you want a little bit lighter at this stage, what you can do is you can get a tissue and you can just blob it on to your piece of paper and take off a little bit of the pigment so it just softens it down. Careful not to overwork it because you do want some colour on there. But you might just want a few areas that are a little bit softer in tone. Now down here's a little bit more orangey, so I'm going to take a little bit of cadmium red, just mix that into my yellow ochre, and for a little bit more of that orangey tone just down here, and maybe a little bit just above the roof line because that'll look rather lovely. Just right there. So be careful not to play around this too much, because it's really easy to get dirty if you're adding too many colours on. So I'm going to stop there and I'm going to let that dry. Now I'm going to come back and I'm going to bring in a little bit of a darker shade for the clouds up in the topper areas of this picture, but I need it to dry before I can do that. If you do a wet layer onto a dry piece of paper, it'll stay exactly where you want it to, and that's my plan for the darker tones of clouds. If you put anything onto this wet stage, it's just going to end up bleeding out and it won't have any clear edge definition, so do keep that in mind. So now while that's drying, I'm going to look at getting some clean water. You do have to keep your water clean, and then I'm going to come back and work on the building of St Paul's. Okay, so while that's drying, let's put in a few of the sun highlights on the building. So I'm going to use a little bit of yellow ochre. I'm going to dilute down so it's fairly pale, and I'm looking at the direction of the sun going down, so I can see on this side it's lighter than this side of the building, and you can see it slightly on the curve and a little bit on this side of the building. So let's just put in a gentle, and that is a little bit stronger than I anticipated, tone of yellow ochre. Now if it is too strong, like mine is, I won't worry about it too much because watercolours always dry slightly lighter than you anticipate, but just take a tissue and go over and lift off a little bit so that it's softer in tone. Now I'm going to take some raw burnt sienna, not raw, burnt sienna, and mix in a little bit of ultramarine blue. You should get like a grey tone. You see that go grey? Now if you add in a lot of colour, obviously it'll be quite a strong grey tone. If you dilute it with water, it'll be fairly light and soft. If I do a little bit down there, it's quite a nice shadow tone. I'm going to then bring that in and start building up a bit of shadow tone on this building. And I'm going to try and keep my brush marks fairly loose and light, so it's just insinuation. As it's a softer layer tone that we're going to be working further up on, don't worry if you don't, there she says, don't worry if you apply too much, because we're going to be working it up to a much deeper level as we go along. Right, so while that's drying, I'm going to just fill in this beautiful blue roof. I use a very mild cobalt blue. And then I'm going to take the cobalt blue and mix that in with that grey tone. Just give me a slightly different shade. The balcony that's running around. And a little bit of shadow work along the bottom here, which is quite nice. There's a slight bluey twang to the shadow work. Okay, and you should see it's starting to come along quite nicely. So what I need to do is obviously work this area up to a darker level, but I can't do that while this is all wet or it's just going to bleed and I'm going to dilute my colour and constantly chase my own tail. So while that's doing its thing and drying, or if you want to speed it up you could blast it with a hairdryer, I'm going to just work down in this area of the trees and the foreground and give that a little bit more of a push. So again, I'm going to take that sap green and I'm going to add in my ultramarine blue. I get a really nice strong dark green that looks quite organic. I'm going to start working in a few dots to build up the texture. Now I'm not going to overwork this because I love this little dotty effect that I've got from my toothbrush. And remember that's going to come through anyway, you'll see that drafting through. This green is quite translucent, but it's going to build it up and give it a little bit more crisper edge definition. What you can also do is you can take your card, you can scratch through it and get a very different kind of line. With something like this you probably want to crisscross. That'll just soften off the edge of the brush mark so they're not so crisp and hard. And that'll make it appear more organic. Scratch into it. Remember it's 300 GSM paper, so it can take quite a hard battering. You can scratch through some of the bits of green just to show those dotty tones to get a more organic result. Right, so while that section is just drying, and you can work that up, you know, darker or lighter. It's completely, you know, as far as you want to take it really. You can bleed in a few areas if you wanted to. So I can see like this tree sitting behind here. Just thought I'd boost that up. And if you wanted to, you could always take like a cadmium yellow and make that green a little bit lighter in a few areas. Just to exaggerate some light coming along the top of the trees from that setting sun. There we go. Now while that's drying, I'm going to come up and build up my darker cloud formation, which is what I said I was going to do. And I'm going to use my favourite kind of mix of the old burnt sienna with my ultramarine blue. It's a really good go-to combination. The dark grey tones that look natural rather than anything that's kind of harsh. Using a black can be a bit harsh. Now I have no problems with using a black, you can use blacks, but it's always wise to use a black in conjunction with another colour, not on its own, or it'll look very flat and unnatural. You can see there, I'm just mixing up that grey tone, and I'm going to dilute that down and have it fairly light. And I'm going to just bring in a little bit of cloud work. Kind of coming in over the side of this building. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there because, you know, you don't want to overwork this or it'll end up looking really messy. Try and keep it fairly light and soft, she says as she continues to work into it, but you know what I mean. And I'm going to leave that to dry because I want to work on this building, and if I work on this building anywhere where I've got these wet greens at the moment and wet cloud formations, it's going to start bleeding and I'm going to lose the darks. So I'm going to come in with my nice crisp hard darks and then the picture will be ready, you know, for framing obviously. I'll see you in a moment. Right, so I've cleaned my palette, I've got some fresh water as always, which is a good move, and then I'm going to start working up on my buildings. Now it's still a little bit wet around the edges, but I'm not too worried about that. I'm just going to mist those and work on the bits that are workable. So let's mix up some colour. First of all, for the building, I need to take it up to another tone really. So I'm going to have those softer light tones, which you've seen me do already. Then I'm going to have those mid tones that I'm going to work up now, and then I'm going to have the really crisp dark areas. So for the next shade, take a light red, if you have a light red. If not, it's kind of brick brown. I'm not sure they sell brick browns in the art shop, but that's the kind of tone you're looking for. Then add a little bit of an ultramarine. And again, it'll give you a kind of a nice shadowy tone. It's a little bit of a plummy kind of browny grey. Now, while I've got that, then I'm going to start working this up a bit more. So let's bring in a little bit more shadow work on things. Remember, you don't want to overwork it because you want to kind of keep that initial tones that you've already added in. And if you paint too much, you'll cover them all up. Now you can always take a little bit of water, then you clean your brush, and then you can just smooth out any areas if you're finding that you need that transition from light to dark. The trick is how wet your brush is, making sure that it's clean. That looks good. So it's already a little bit more lighter. It feels ephemeral, which is the beauty of watercolours. They have that gentle transition of light and dark in a transparency layer of colour. Now, while that's just sorting itself out, let's make a neutral tint. I'm going to take a bigger brush so I can make a decent quantity of it. Right, so for the neutral tint, let's start work, shall we? Take a bit of cadmium yellow. Brush, I'm going to take some crimson red to make an orange, and I'm going to take a little bit of ultramarine blue. Now you have to mix the blue in so that it goes a slight grey tone. At the moment it's going a bit greeny. That means I've got a lot of blue and yellow because that's what makes green. I haven't quite got enough of the crimson red. I'm going to add in a little bit more crimson red, and this can be a bit of an ongoing battle where you're trying to rebalance out the shades to make it just right. Alright, I'm adding in the ultramarine blue. That's looking better. That looks pretty good. Alright, clean my brush, and then I'm going to take a finer brush. So you can see here I've got a really fine brush. This is a number 2. Pick up a little bit my neutral tint and start working it into my building. Right, so there you go. Now I'm probably going to need to just create some darker green in a few areas to give the contrast between the foreground and the background. So you can see here I need to bring in a little bit more darker green just to exaggerate that tree that's sitting behind there. There you go. Now you can see here how I could still put in those greens if I wanted to, but I think I'll just leave it as it is. I quite like this as a quick, spontaneous, little fun, quirky study. And I hope you've enjoyed that. And let's move on to the next one, shall we now? See you in a moment once I've cleaned up.